Nuclear science has provided mankind with immense potential to do good, to treat and perhaps cure some of the most deadly of diseases, to provide virtually free electricity, to investigate the structure of the universe, to examine the most detailed mechanisms of the human body. It has also, of course, provided the world with something else.
This is the nightmare of the second half of the 20th century. A suitcase with an atomic bomb inside it. Once you steal the nuclear material, any physics graduate can do the rest. It's a timing device with an electrical circuit that fires two explosive charges which push the radioactive material together fast enough for it to go critical, and boom. And there is no security force on Earth that can prevent some fanatical nutcase from placing this gently in downtown anywhere. This breakthrough in military technology completely unbalances the situation carefully worked for over the last 30 years by the major nuclear powers. The nightmare is what the result will be. One of the results of the breakthrough in military technology that happened here was that I'm speaking to you in English instead of a language closer, say, to Dutch, because this is the site of the Battle of Hastings in 1066. That abbey up there was built to commemorate the event. The battle itself lasted maybe 5.5 hours. It was an immensely violent affair, full of sweat and fear and blood. Hand-to-hand combat in those days was unbelievably unpleasant because it maimed people rather than killing them. You died of your wounds later. They did most of the good work with this. I'd like you to see what it does to a side of meat, because in hand-to-hand combat, that's all a man is. On a bitterly cold morning on October the 14th, 1066, about 16,000 men began to do that as hard and as desperately as they could to each other in this field here. The Saxon King Harold had his headquarters straight up there on the top of the ridge where the abbey is now, and he disposed his men, about 8,000 of them, from over there at the top of that ridge, along the crest of the hill, for about half a mile to the horizon over there as far as you can see. Now, of those 8,000 men, he had about 5,000 professional soldiers exhausted from a 270-mile march in the previous 10 days, backed up by about 3,500 local farmers who'd been given hammers and pitchforks and billhooks to do whatever they could with. They were told, come here and do your thing. Now, in front of him, in front of Harold, about 150 meters down the hill, ranged also along left to right, were the troops of William the Conqueror. 8,000 men again, but all battle-hardened, well-trained troops. 1,000 archers, 4,000 heavy infantry, and 3,000 cavalry. Okay. The battle started, went on all morning. Nobody could make any headway going up. The Normans could get nothing against the Saxons, who just stood there and fought them to a standstill all the time. Around noon, everybody stopped. They pulled apart, they picked up their weapons, they had something to drink, something to eat, and at about 3 o'clock they started again. And this time, William sent his cavalry straight up the hill at the Saxon shield wall. It banged up against it and got no further. And they fought and fought and fought until finally the Norman cavalry began to pull back. And it was then that the Saxons made their real mistake. The Saxons broke lines and came chasing down here after the Normans. And here on level ground, where I'm standing, was where England became Norman, because it was here that the Saxons allowed the Normans the one advantage, that one technological device they had that the Saxons didn't have. And it was the use of that device that changed the history of the Western world irrevocably.
It's the way the Normans fought that tells you they were using that device. Look, see the long shield? That's used to protect the left side of the body because the rider's carrying a lance with the other hand, so he can't fight off an attack. And the only reason you use a lance like that is if you've got the device the Normans were using. The stirrup. The Saxons lost because the Normans were fighting from horseback thanks to the stirrup. Trouble was, you hit so hard, you lost your lance. As the stirrup went into more general use, the first change it brought about was this: a bit of cloth you could use to help heave your lance back out of the corpse. 60 years after Hastings, anybody who was anybody was fighting from horseback, wearing more armour to protect themselves, so they were heavier. So while the massive shock of the impact might kill the other guy, it knocked you backwards off your horse, and a fat lot of use you were to anybody in a heap on the ground. Still, this was such a good way to slaughter people, there had to be some way to make it work. And by the middle of the 12th century, they'd come up with what they thought was the answer. They raised the back of the saddle so the rider couldn't come off, and strengthened the saddle girth. Unfortunately, that just transferred the shock to the poor old horse. The only answer was a stronger horse that could take all that punishment. And rearing big horses, as anybody who knows will tell you, ain't cheap. Now, keeping a man like that supplied with the latest weaponry and horses in a period when there was very little money in circulation needed the kind of wealth that could only come from land and peasants working it. So, as you'll see, the coming of the knight changed the basic structure of society. It also gave birth to the tournament. Now, in all the books, they're shown like that. But in reality, they were very different. Early on, the tournament was a kind of cross between the circus coming to town and a wild free-for-all, where half the time things ended in absolute shambles with whole towns getting burnt down. Things got so out of hand, even the Pope tried to ban the fun and games. Yes, these were definitely not the days of courtly manners and fair play. But behind all the chicanery and dirty tricks, there were two very good reasons for these affairs, and they both had to do with fighting on horseback. See, the idea of cavalry was a whole new thing, and you needed all the training you could get to use the lance right. The other reason had to do with the prizes you won. You knocked a guy off his horse at a tournament, and you took everything: his armour, his saddle, his horse, the lot. And that was as good as a free ticket to the upper classes, because it was only when you possessed all the right equipment and the horses that you got into the big league. By 1250, the Big League was a very exclusive club only the very rich could join, thanks, in the first place, to the stirrup and the way it had led to the fully armoured knight on his massive war horse. The aristocrats now made sure the club stayed exclusive. They made knighthood hereditary and took on permanent family names instead of just being son of somebody. And because the armour covered their faces, they needed identification marks to show who they were in battle, so they didn't get clobbered by their own men. These heraldic symbols completed the